At 65, I trusted my own flesh and blood enough to move into their home, believing family meant safety and care. Instead, I became invisible, a shadow relegated to a cold basement, treated less like a mother and more like a servant. The hands that once held me with love now handed me chores wrapped in silence and disdain. This is the story of betrayal, endurance, and the slow fight to reclaim my voice and dignity. If you value stories that touch the soul and reveal hard truths, please subscribe, because now, this journey begins. Marianne's life began not with fanfare, but with the soft, steady rhythm of the land. She was born into a family that knew hardship but never let it break their spirit, children of the prairie, who learned early to read the weather in the clouds and find comfort in the earth beneath their feet. Her hands, calloused and steady, held the memory of every seed sown, every fence mended, every animal fed in the chill of morning. To Marianne, life was a mosaic of simple tasks done with care, each one a thread in the fabric of home. It was on that land she met Jack, a man whose quiet strength matched her own. Jack didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight, solid and reliable as the oak trees that marked the boundaries of their farm. Together, they carved out a life that was modest but rich with meaning. Their marriage wasn't a story of grand romance, but of steady partnership, of shared glances and unspoken understandings, of working side by side through seasons of plenty and seasons of want. They raised their family in a house that wasn't much more than a weathered frame of wood and creaky floors, but it was theirs. The scent of old pine mingled with the earthy aroma of freshly turned soil, and in the kitchen, the warmth of a stove filled the air with a promise of comfort. Summer evenings were spent watching fireflies dance over the wheat fields. Winters were for sitting close by the fire, wrapped in quilts, sharing stories and silence. For more than 40 years, Marianne and Jack moved through life as two halves of a whole, their days marked by the same steady rhythms: the lowing of cows at dawn, the crack of leather boots on frozen ground, the slow turning of the seasons. Their bond was forged not in grand gestures, but in everyday acts. The way Jack would wait with coffee for Marianne on cold mornings, the way she kept the house tidy and the animals fed even when her back ached from long hours. When Jack passed, the farm seemed to hold its breath, the silence settling like snow over the fields. Marianne was left with the weight of memories that filled every corner. The old shirt hung carefully in the closet, the faded photograph stacked in a drawer, the quilt that smelled faintly of pine and tobacco. The house groaned and creaked in the wind, but it was hers to keep, and for a time, it was enough. She kept the routines that had once been shared. Every morning before the sun rose, Marianne pulled on her worn boots and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She made her way to the barn, the cold air biting at her skin, the earth crunching underfoot. Feeding the cows was more than a task. It was a conversation she had with the land and the animals, a way to keep life moving forward when the world felt like it was standing still. Inside the house, Marianne moved slowly but deliberately, patching leaks with duct tape and spare shingles, tending to the garden that Jack had once loved, keeping the taxes paid on the land that had been in her family for generations. She was fiercely independent, proud of the fact that she could still manage the farm on her own, even as the days grew shorter and her body weaker. But solitude, no matter how chosen, carries its own burdens. The nights stretched long and quiet. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, was now filled with whispers of the past. Marianne would sit by the window with a cup of strong black coffee, gazing at the faded photo of Jack in his old uniform. His smile was steady, familiar, an anchor in the tide of loneliness. Her son David lived miles away, in a city that moved too fast for the slow, deliberate life Marianne knew. When she heard his voice on the phone, it was usually brief, well wishes on holidays, a quick check-in before the demands of his own life pulled him away. His world was one of offices and meetings, polished shoes and clipped emails, a world that seemed a universe apart from the endless fields and creaking farmstead Marianne called home. Their conversations were polite but distant, measured with a careful civility that barely concealed the growing space between them. Marianne listened to David speak of his work, his ambitions, the little triumphs and setbacks of his life, but there was a hollowness beneath the surface, an unspoken sense that the ties that once bound them were loosening. She tried not to let it show, holding on to the hope that family meant more than geography, that love could bridge the gap of years and miles. Yet in the quiet moments, Marianne felt the ache of being left behind, the slow erosion of connection that no amount of phone calls could repair. Still, she kept the farm alive. The soil beneath her fingers, the soft rustle of wheat in the breeze, the steady heartbeat of the land, these were her companions, the keepers of her strength. She was a woman who had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, who had known loss and love in equal measure, and who refused to be defined by either. The knock on the door came early one chilly morning, unexpected and sudden. Marianne wiped her hands on her apron, her heart stirring with a mixture of hope and hesitation. Standing there was David, her son, transformed from the boy she once knew into a man she barely recognized. His clothes were crisp and modern, his hair neatly trimmed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. There was a new confidence in his step, a polished ease that seemed at odds with the worn wooden floorboards beneath his feet. David's smile was practiced, a mask perfected over years spent navigating boardrooms and client meetings. "Mom," he said quickly, almost too quickly, glancing down at the phone in his hand as if tethered to a world she wasn't part of. "It's freezing out here. Can we get inside?" Marianne nodded, stepping aside to let him in, her mind already racing through the possibilities that brought him back to this quiet farm after so long away. She busied herself with heating the stove, pulling out some soup she'd made the day before, baking bread fresh that morning. Each small act was a silent offering, a way to welcome back the boy she remembered beneath the polished veneer. But David barely looked around. His eyes flicked repeatedly to the screen in his hand, fingers scrolling, tapping, eyes darting. The home she had tended for so long, the walls filled with decades of memories, the creaking floors, the familiar scent of pine and earth, seemed to shrink under his gaze. When he finally set the phone down and met her eyes, the practiced warmth faltered. "Mom, you can't keep living out here like this," he said, his voice steady but edged with something Marianne couldn't quite place. "You're too old. What if you fall? What if something happens in the night and no one's around?" Marianne offered a small smile, the kind that held both defiance and resignation. "I've managed this far," she replied softly, her voice carrying years of quiet endurance. David's expression tightened. "Seriously," he pressed, "this place isn't safe anymore. You need people around you. You need family. Claire and we want you to come live with us." The invitation hung in the air, draped in the guise of love and concern. David painted pictures of a warm, bustling home with space just for her, a private room with a view of their backyard garden Claire had lovingly tended, meals thoughtfully prepared, closets rearranged to make room for Marianne's things. Everything was planned, rehearsed, polished. Yet beneath the surface of his words, Marianne sensed an unspoken weight. Later, in the quiet moments after David's departure, the shadow behind the offer crept forward, a request that unsettled her deeply. David needed capital, he said. A mortgage on the farm would secure a loan to expand his business. Just a formality, he assured her, as casual as asking for sugar. Marianne stared at the chip tile of the kitchen counter, the winter wind rattling the windows like a warning. The farm was more than land. It was legacy, history, the heartbeat of her life. To mortgage it felt like trading a piece of her soul for promises whispered too softly to believe. Inside, a storm brewed. Love for her son wrestled with the sharp edge of suspicion. She found herself caught between the aching need to trust and the whisper of instinct telling her to hold tight to what was hers. Memories rose unbidden, long years of sacrifice, of giving without question. Fear gnawed at her, the fear of becoming a burden, of losing the last thread of independence she clung to. But alongside it burned a fierce desire to keep her autonomy, to remain the woman who stood tall despite the passing years. That night, Marianne sat alone by the dim glow of the kitchen light, tracing the cracks in the old wooden table. The weight of the decision pressed on her chest, heavy and unyielding. Trust felt fragile. Love felt complicated. The road ahead was shrouded in uncertainty, and the place she called home was no longer just a refuge. It was a battleground. The journey from the sprawling fields of Kansas to the polished streets of the city was a slow unraveling for Marianne. David drove with practiced ease, his hands steady on the wheel, while she sat stiffly beside him, a cushion tucked behind her back that offered little relief. The road stretched endlessly, a stark contrast to the familiar dirt paths and wide-open skies she had always known. When they arrived at the cul-de-sac lined with identical beige houses and neatly trimmed lawns, Marianne felt a knot tighten in her chest. The house was grand, too grand, she thought, 2 stories rising sharply against the sky, white columns standing stiff and formal like sentinels. The perfectly manicured boxwood hedges looked as if they had been sculpted by some unseen hand, their precision cold and unnatural. Stepping out of the truck, Marianne's boots still carried the dust of the farm. For a moment, she imagined the rough earth beneath her feet back home, the scent of pine and soil, the soft rustling of wheat in the wind. Here, the world smelled of concrete and polish, the air thin and sharp. Claire opened the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her blouse was crisp, her makeup precise, lips painted a shade too bright for the soft light. "Welcome, Mom," she said, stepping aside in a way that felt more like an announcement than an embrace. Inside, the house felt sterile. Every surface gleamed, every corner carefully arranged, as if meant to impress rather than comfort. The living room boasted a fireplace that looked untouched, its mantle bare of the warmth Marianne had once found in such spaces. The kitchen resembled a showroom, all stainless steel and smooth countertops, a place where meals were prepared with efficiency rather than love. David led Marianne down a narrow flight of stairs near the garage, flicking on a harsh fluorescent light. "We thought this would be best for now," he said, gesturing to the basement. "It's quiet, you'll have privacy." Marianne stepped into the cramped, windowless room, the air thick with the faint scent of rubber and mildew. Stacks of plastic bins labeled with holiday decorations crowded one wall, and a dusty workbench sat opposite a narrow cot made up with a thin blanket and a single flat pillow. Her toiletries were neatly arranged on a crate that served as a makeshift nightstand, and Jack's photo, folded gently into her bag, felt heavier than ever. No warmth filled this space. No echoes of laughter, no soft morning light filtering through curtains. It was a storage room masquerading as a bedroom, a place to be hidden away rather than welcomed. Claire handed Marianne a printed schedule titled Grandma's Daily Routine, the words typed up and color-coded like a corporate checklist. From breakfast at 6:30 a.m. to packing lunches, helping dress the granddaughter Sarah, sweeping, wiping, recycling, laundry, folding, prepping dinner ingredients. The day was mapped out with ruthless precision. "We just want you to feel useful," Claire said brightly, as if usefulness alone defined Marianne's worth. But the chores felt less like help and more like control. Each task assigned, each comment clipped and sharp, chipped away at Marianne's sense of self. When she missed a detail, Claire's glance was a silent reprimand, a reminder that mistakes were not tolerated. "Don't use hot water on that blouse, it's silk," Claire snapped one afternoon. Marianne's apologies were quiet, but inside, a storm brewed. David's presence was equally distant. He would kiss Claire on the cheek, chat briefly with Sarah about school, tell stories of meetings gone awry, but his eyes rarely met Marianne's. She became a fixture in the background, a piece of furniture whose movements were expected but whose presence was unnoticed. Despite this, Marianne clung fiercely to what she could control. She cooked the meals, cleaned the floors, prepared lunches with the same care she had always given. Her hands, once strong and sure, trembled slightly as she stirred pots and folded laundry, but the routine anchored her to a fading identity. Yet loneliness wrapped itself around her like a shroud. In a house full of people, Marianne felt more invisible than ever, her voice unheard, her needs dismissed. The sharp sting of isolation cut deep, carving away at her dignity until she questioned whether she still mattered. The basement room, with its cold concrete floor and flickering yellow bulb, became a symbol of confinement, not just physical, but emotional. Here, Marianne was out of sight, tucked away as if her presence were inconvenient, her life less important than the polished surfaces above. The subtle cruelties, the clipped tones, the indifferent silences, the daily small humiliations, were harder to bear than any outright hostility. They whispered that Marianne was less than, that age and dependency rendered her invisible, expendable. And yet, beneath it all, a quiet ember of resilience smoldered. Marianne's spirit, though battered, refused to extinguish. In the depths of that shadowed room, she held on to memories of fields and family, of strength born from hardship, and of a love that had once been fierce and unbreakable. Days in the city house folded into one another like faded photographs, each indistinguishable from the last, except for the mounting weight settling deeper into Marianne's bones. The ache wasn't just physical. Though her knees protested the cold concrete floor of the basement room and her back stiffened with each strained movement. It was an ache born of invisibility, of spirit slowly withering beneath the relentless shadow of neglect. Each morning she woke to a body that felt heavier, as if the years had stacked themselves into bricks that chained her to this place. Yet the heaviest weight was the silence, a silence that screamed louder than any words. Marianne found herself shrinking into the edges of rooms, folding herself smaller to fit into spaces where she was least noticed. There were moments when that silence shattered briefly with a surge of anger, quiet, fierce rages that burned behind her eyes, flames she could never afford to show. Helplessness followed swiftly, a hollow ache that carved through her heart. She mourned the life she'd known, the wide-open skies, the comforting creak of the barn, the steady rhythm of days lived fully and freely. In the depths of her solitude, Marianne reached for a small notebook she kept hidden beneath a folded sweatshirt, the last refuge for her voice. She wrote feverishly, scrawling thoughts and fragments of memory, lines meant to keep her mind from rusting away. Each word was a lifeline, a whisper against the growing void. It was through this writing that Marianne began to remember herself. Not the ghost drifting in a storage room, but a woman who had loved fiercely, who had built a life with her own hands and heart. The notebook held her rebellion, quiet but unyielding. Amid this darkness, a fragile light appeared in the form of Charlotte. Charlotte was a woman not unlike Marianne, older, worn by life's harsh edges, and carrying her own scars of family rejection. Marianne met her one cold afternoon near the laundromat, a small figure wrapped in a faded red parka, eyes bright with quiet understanding. They spoke little at first, exchanging nods and smiles, small courtesies in a city where strangers barely acknowledged each other. Invited into Charlotte's modest apartment, Marianne found warmth she hadn't known she was missing. The air smelled faintly of cinnamon and old books. A space heater hummed softly by the window, casting a golden glow over mismatched furniture and faded photographs. The room was small but alive with humanity, contrasting starkly with the sterile loneliness of Marianne's assigned quarters. There, over cheap tea and shared biscuits, they began weaving the threads of a friendship born from shared wounds. They spoke of lost loves, broken promises, and dreams deferred. Charlotte's laughter was a balm. Marianne's stories found an eager ear. In each other, they found refuge, a space where vulnerability was met with compassion, not judgment. But the quiet grip of Marianne's life in the city tightened once more, leading to a breaking point. One afternoon, a small accident in the laundry room shattered the fragile veneer of civility. Marianne, fumbling with a bottle of detergent, let it slip, blue liquid pooling across the tiles. Claire's arrival was immediate, her voice sharp and accusing. "What are you doing? That stuff isn't cheap." Marianne froze, heart pounding, knees weak. She bent to clean up the spill, but Claire's presence was a wall. No help offered, only disdain. David appeared, saw the scene, and turned away without a word. The sting of abandonment cut deeper than any harsh word. That night, the room felt colder, the silence heavier. Marianne sat clutching her notebook, tears unspilled but felt in every breath. She realized then that this was no longer a home, no longer a place where she was valued or loved. With quiet resolve, Marianne packed what little she could: Jack's photo, her worn coat, the notebook that had become her voice. Without fanfare or explanation, she slipped out into the night, the chill biting but strangely liberating. The streetlights cast long shadows as she walked away, leaving behind a life that had slowly stripped her of everything but her will to live on her own terms. Marianne's footsteps were heavy but determined as she approached the small brick building tucked quietly behind rows of city offices, the Senior Legal Aid Center. It was an unassuming place, its faded blue sign weathered by time. Yet to Marianne it held the promise of something she had long thought lost, a chance to be heard, to reclaim what was taken from her. Inside, she met Marcus, a young law student with an earnest face and eyes that held none of the judgment she had grown accustomed to. He greeted her with a gentle smile, his voice steady but kind, as if he understood the weight she carried without needing it spelled out. Sitting together in a modest office filled with legal texts and framed certificates, Marianne found herself telling the story she had kept buried for so long. Words that had choked her in silence now flowed quietly but insistently. Her move from the farm, the cold basement room, the chores assigned as duties, the sharp criticisms and silent exclusions. She spoke of the mortgage David had pushed her to sign, the feeling of betrayal that cut deeper than any wound. Marcus listened, nodding occasionally, his attention unwavering. He explained patiently what Marianne had begun to suspect, that what she endured was not simply a family misunderstanding, but a serious case of elder financial abuse. He spoke of laws designed to protect people like her, of rights that could restore her autonomy and dignity. The process ahead was slow and uncertain. There were forms to fill, evidence to gather, legal jargon to decipher. Marcus walked her through each step, clarifying what to expect, and assuring her that she would not face this alone. For the first time in months, Marianne felt a flicker of hope, not the kind born of promises, but of knowledge and agency. Next came the meeting with Evelyn Grant, a seasoned attorney whose reputation for fierce advocacy was matched only by the compassion she showed her clients. Evelyn's eyes were sharp, her demeanor professional yet warm, an anchor Marianne desperately needed. As they sat together reviewing stacks of papers, mortgage agreements, records of David's business expansions, notes detailing the mistreatment, Marianne felt the weight of years pressing down anew. Evelyn's questions were pointed but gentle, probing both facts and feelings. Marianne found herself wrestling not only with the details of the case but with the tangled emotions beneath: guilt for confronting her own son, sorrow over fractured family bonds, fear of what the fight might bring. Preparing for court was a journey into unknown territory. Marianne's resolve grew stronger even as old doubts whispered in the corners of her mind. She clung to the belief that this battle was not about vengeance, but about justice, for herself, for the dignity stolen, and for the life she deserved to live. The courthouse was nothing like Marianne had imagined in her quiet moments of hope and dread. No grand pillars, no marble staircases, no dramatic bursts of emotion. Instead, it was a squat, utilitarian building, walls painted in muted beige, floors covered in faded linoleum that smelled faintly of old paper and polish. The room where her fate would be decided was small, functional. Plastic chairs arranged stiffly around a single wooden table, a judge's bench looming quietly at the front. Marianne sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, a knitted sweater shielding her from the chill. Beside her sat Evelyn, flipping through notes with a calm intensity that steadied Marianne's nerves. Across the table were David and Claire, dressed in their polished best, their faces carefully neutral, their lawyer shuffling papers like thorns tucked between pages. When the hearing began, the air was taut with tension. David's lawyer attempted to frame Marianne as unstable, suggesting years of isolation had clouded her judgment. He spoke of misunderstandings and family complexities, his voice faltering at times, betraying the weakness of the defense. Then came Marianne's moment. She rose, steady despite the trembling she felt beneath the surface. She did not shout or demand retribution. Instead, she spoke softly but firmly, her words measured, each one carrying the weight of a lifetime of sacrifice and betrayal. "I am not here to punish anyone," she said, her voice echoing in the still room. "I want my rights back. I want to live the rest of my days with dignity, not as a burden or a shadow." She recounted the cold basement, the daily chores imposed as obligation, the humiliation hidden beneath polite smiles. She spoke of love twisted into control, of a home lost to promises broken. The judge listened intently, her gaze steady and clear. She nodded as Marianne finished, then read aloud the relevant statutes, protections against elder financial abuse, the invalidity of coerced agreements. The mortgage was declared void, the farm restored to Marianne's name. David and Claire faced consequences, not with loud protests, but with bowed heads and silent acceptance. The weight of their actions settled over the room like a heavy fog. Marianne felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Instead, relief, deep and quiet, mingled with the ache of fractured family ties. Returning home was both a physical and emotional journey. Marianne traveled back with Charlotte, whose steady presence was a balm. The farm greeted them with open fields and familiar creeks, the scent of pine and earth a balm to Marianne's soul. Together, they set about repairing not just the porch and fences, but the fragile threads of Marianne's life. Each nail hammered and paint brushed was a step toward reclaiming more than property. It was reclaiming identity. Neighbors like Mrs. Connors returned, bringing lemon bars and stories, filling the house with warmth and laughter. Marianne found joy in simple routines again, the rhythm of days marked by rising sun and the soft rustle of wheat. Healing was slow, measured, sometimes painful. But with every shared smile, every evening on the porch wrapped in blankets, Marianne rediscovered the dignity that had been stolen. Her story was no longer one of silent suffering, but of resilience, justice, and the quiet power of reclaiming one's voice. The soft hum of the wheat fields outside Marianne's restored farmhouse whispered secrets of endurance, of seasons past and seasons yet to come. Sitting on the creaking porch with a steaming cup of tea in her hands, Marianne gazed at the golden waves bending in the gentle breeze, a sight both familiar and profoundly symbolic. Each stalk seemed to carry the weight of her journey, resilient yet yielding, rooted yet free. In the quiet moments, Marianne's thoughts drifted to what she had lost and what she had found. To be a mother was, she once believed, to give endlessly without expectation, a vessel of unconditional love. Yet her journey had taught her a harsher truth. Love, when tangled with control, could suffocate rather than nurture. Boundaries were not walls to shut others out, but lines drawn to protect the self, to preserve dignity. She reflected on her own identity, not just as a mother or a widow, but as a woman worthy of respect, a person whose value was not measured by usefulness or convenience. The years of silence and invisibility had carved deep scars, but they had also shaped a spirit unbroken. Marianne had learned that reclaiming one's voice was an act of courage, often quiet but fiercely transformative. Her world had expanded beyond the farm's fence through the friendships that had blossomed in the darkest hours. Charlotte, with her steady laughter and open heart, had become more than a neighbor. She was chosen family, a companion in healing. Together with Mrs. Connors, whose lemon bars and stories brought warmth like the first fire of autumn, they had created a circle of care that mended the frayed edges of Marianne's spirit. These friendships were woven from shared vulnerability, from laughter that echoed against the harshness of past betrayals, from simple acts of kindness that held more meaning than grand gestures. In their company, Marianne rediscovered the joy of connection, a reminder that family was sometimes chosen, not just born. The wheat fields themselves seemed to embody this quiet strength. They swayed not because they were untouched by wind, but because they bent with grace, rooted deeply enough to endure. Marianne saw in them a mirror of her own resilience, a testament to survival and the gentle power of steadfastness. As she looked toward the horizon, Marianne's thoughts turned to those who might hear her story. To the audience, she posed gentle but urgent questions. What does dignity mean in your life? How do you recognize when love becomes control? When do we find the courage to set boundaries and reclaim our worth? She spoke not with judgment, but with invitation to stand up against neglect, to seek help when needed, and to remember that self-respect is never too late to claim. Age does not diminish voice or value. Sometimes, it is the time when those things matter most. Her story was a whisper and a shout, a call to awareness wrapped in hope. It was a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there is a path back to peace. That healing is possible when we open ourselves to care, both given and received. And so, Marianne's journey continued, not as a tale closed, but as a life renewed, rooted in the past but reaching forward with cautious hope. The fields outside danced in the breeze, steady and sure, as did she. Thank you for joining Marianne's journey, a story of strength, resilience, and reclaiming one's voice against all odds. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this. And remember, take care of yourself. Your health and well-being matter now more than ever.